This next film is one of the simplest movies in the entire Disney canon, but that's why this one works, because going in, I wasn't expecting something high stakes, because this book series has always focused on the lives of its characters, and this film understands that. While I have not been kind to disconnected stories in the Disney Canon Marathon, this is the one of the places where it works better. Which, yes, without making it feel like a collection of shorts compact into one movie, but the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh is where this works. The story is technically a collection of different adventures involving Pooh and his friends, which, unlike the anthology films from the 1940s, the structure here works well, thanks to its setting and characters. The low stakes allows the charm of 100 Acre Wood to take the center of the movie, and this is where the movie succeeds the most, such as Pooh getting stuck in Rabbit's doorway after coming around for honey, or any form of misunderstanding that goes around in 100 Acre Wood. And my favourite sequence in the movie had to be Pooh's dream, because of how visually appealing it is. There are some issues with the pacing, such as some segments being longer than others, but unlike the package films from the 1940s, these weren't actually frustrating to sit through. The animation is still charming after 5 decades, especially in its storybook presentation, where the different characters interact with the pages and text within the book, which, yeah, just like Winnie the Pooh from 2011, the stylistic choice that carried over to there was also present here. The cast of characters are what carried the movie, but they don't really need development in them to actually make them enjoyable, with my standout being Tigger, thanks to how energetic he is. And while the songs are not on the heights of Disney's greatest songs, the wonderful thing about Tigger's was my standout. And like in 2011, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh does not aim to be on the heights of their greatest, but all I can ask for from a Winnie the Pooh film is to stay true to the books, and I think it achieves that well. This is our first Renaissance film in quite a while. I know a lot of people are thinking this is an experimental era film, but because this film originally released in 1999, I consider this a Renaissance film. Meaning, from films Dinosaur to Bolt is what I consider experimental. And since we've not had a Renaissance film appear in the list since placement 52, but even though we are going to have more Renaissance films from this point onward, you would expect most of them to be in the top quarter, right? Well, as beloved as the Renaissance is with many, I can't say I loved everything to have released in that era. Like I have said with Pocahontas and The Rescuers Down Under earlier in the ranking, and this next film is just one I liked. And I didn't know going in how this was going to compare to the original. But unlike every other film in the Renaissance, this one was not driven by a story, but instead, Fantasia 2000 brings in tons of musical sequences. Like I said, Fantasia 2000 doesn't really have a story, but is made up for that within its variety in each segment, which does tell a story of its own through the visuals and the music. I did enjoy a lot of these animated sequences, in which the live-action introductions to me felt mixed, since it does take away from the movie, but seeing James L. Jones was epic. I'm not complaining about the James L. Jones segment, but everyone else felt out of place. These segments were not as engaging as the animated sequences, but when Mickey interacted with the presenters, had to be better than a lot of the other live-action sequences in this film. The animation had to be the movie's biggest strength, since each segment is unique and in its identity, such as sparring whales, the flamingos in the yo-yo segment, and the Noah's Ark segment with Donald and Daisy Duck. The pacing does thankfully move quickly, thanks to its anthology structure, but unlike the original Fantasia, which does include an intermission halfway through, this one doesn't feel as if you need to take a break halfway through the movie. Fantasia 2000, like the original Fantasia, is not a film you watch for its plot, but rather to see how music and animation complement each other, which does succeed as a good movie. Just before the worst Disney movie in Dinosaur the year after. Now this take might have to be my spiciest in the entire marathon, because I know a lot of Disney fans consider this one to be one of Disney's greatest works, and while I do respect its importance, thanks to its kickstart in the Disney Renaissance, I didn't fully connect on the same level as other people, which there is still a lot to enjoy here, but unlike other Renaissance movies like The Lion King, Hercules, or Beauty and the Beast, I had a few flaws stick out in The Little Mermaid revisiting it. The story does do a great job at presenting Ariel as a character and her desire to explore what life is like on the surface, which the biggest issue with this comes from the romance between Ariel and Eric, which their chemistry does work when they are on screen together, but they don't spend enough time together throughout the movie to fully invest in it. Ariel signing the contract for Ursula makes the second half go by too fast, which you can tell the pacing was my biggest flaw with The Little Mermaid as a movie. I know a lot of people call the pacing flawless, but really? The first act spends half of the runtime introducing its characters and the settings, which the opening does feel slower than most Renaissance films, while the second half has to cramp in the time Ariel spends on land, Ursula's contract, the climax, and the ending, which for me seems like too much to have in the last 30 minutes in the movie, which does make it feel rushed. And despite the pacing, The Little Mermaid does have lots of moments that I did enjoy watching, such as Sebastian's scene in the kitchen, the boat scene, and the climax against Ursula. Visually, The Little Mermaid still holds up quite well for a 1989 release, with the underwater environments being vibrant, with the animators finding plenty of creative ways to integrate sea life into a lot of the musical sequences. The song sequences that stood out the most had to be Under the Sea and Kiss the Girl, mainly thanks to how much charm and personality they have in them. The cast of characters is strong overall, with Ariel, who is curious about what life is like on the surface, which does make her a likable character. Sebastian, who has to be the show stealer whenever he's on screen. We have Flounder as well. Triton works well as a father figure, because it's clear that even though he's someone that makes mistakes, he wants to protect Ariel from harm, which that is a reasonable motivation for Triton to have. And Eric might have to be one of the weakest parts of the movie. He is better than the prince in Cinderella, but we don't get an awful lot of time with him. But Ursula, however, is great, with a believable plan, and her manipulation towards Ariel make her sinister, and her personality makes her a compelling villain to watch. The voice acting is still strong throughout, such as Jodie Benson as Ariel, Samuel E. Wright as Sebastian, and Pat Carroll as Ursula. The soundtrack is the biggest strength for me, and despite Daughters of Triton and Poor Unfortunate Souls being the songs I revisit the least, they still serve their function to the overall plot, but with the real bangers being Part of Your World, Under the Sea, and Kiss the Girl, which all remain iconic songs in Disney, which the music does help smooth over some of the pacing issues, because even with two forgettable songs, The Little Mermaid is still a good movie, and while I don't consider it masterpiece level like others, it's still enjoyable, thanks to its expressive animation, great soundtrack, and an entertaining villain. But the reason this is on the weaker end of the Renaissance for me, but just about spares from being anywhere near Pocahontas or The Rescuers Down Under, is because of its pacing. Going into this next movie, I was expecting it just to land close to the middle of the ranking, which it has been years since I last watched this movie, and while I did remember the villain quite well, I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, even with the story being simple, this succeeds because it knows what it is. A fun rescue mission, memorable characters, and if the main villain doesn't scare you, nothing will. 101 Dalmatians. One thing I've not liked about the Silver Age that much is the lack of focus in its movies. But thankfully, 101 Dalmatians was a lot more focused than Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, or even The Sword and the Stone. Pongo and Perdita do make for some likable lead characters, and the rescue mission did keep me invested even better than the rescuers. But one thing I can appreciate, unlike Alice in Wonderland, is how this movie wasn't afraid to have breathing room in here, with scenes such as the puppies resting in the cow shed give both the characters and the people watching a chance to slow down before what happens next. My favourite moment in 101 Dalmatians in general had to be the Twilight Bark scene, where every dog in London passes messages across the country through barking. It is absurd and feels like something you would see in The Secret Life of Pets, but it is presented in a way that is charming. The film does have a great balance between tension and heartwarming moments, even though the pacing is not perfect, since the puppies do get kidnapped around 30 minutes into the movie, which does make it feel a bit late for the conflict to start, but some scenes on the farm do feel a lot longer than they need to be, and the journey home from freeing the other puppies. But thankfully, unlike the other Silver Age films, this one does have slightly better pacing. The main thing that surprised me about 101 Dalmatians is how unique its animation style is from the other Silver Age films, since the rougher outlines are what stood out to me, but as the movie progressed, it became a part of the movie's visual identity, with the background still looking well drawn over 60 years after release, expressive character animations that make the film compelling to watch. But character-wise, this was not a film I found heavy in character development, but the chemistry between Pongo and Perdita was strong, and the various animals throughout the movie were entertaining to watch. The human owners don't get much time on screen, but they're not really needed to contribute to the story. But the real star of the show was Cruella de Vil. Cruella de Vil, which anytime she appeared on screen, she stole the scene, and thanks to her obsession with turning puppies into fur coats, makes her one of the more effective earlier Disney villains in comparison to Lady Tremaine or Madam Mim. The voice acting is still strong throughout, but Cruella's performance is easily the best part of it. And even though I'm more familiar with her portrayals by Glenn Close and Emma Stone, the original version of Cruella still holds up quite well and is still memorable today. The soundtrack was another thing that surprised me, because although it doesn't reinvent things to make it exceptional, the unique identity with its jazz instrumentation is what managed to separate it from other works Disney has made at the time, which might have to be my favourite score pre-Renaissance, excluding Fantasia. But after revisiting the 101 Dalmatians, it reminded me how fun and simple a movie can be when the execution is done right, which is mainly achieved thanks to its memorable characters, entertaining plot, unique art style, and one of the best pre-Renaissance Disney villains in Cruella de Vil. Cruella de Vil, which made it a lot stronger, and even though it's not a complex movie, it's still enjoyable, and one I would happily revisit again in the future if I was to. Next, we get to one Disney classic that has had a massive impact on animation, and even if it's not a personal favourite, I was curious to know if this was one that would hold up, especially considering how important of their earlier works this was. And while I did have more flaws in this than I initially expected, especially in the pacing, I can still appreciate how Bambi has a place in Disney's history, as both dark and charming, with everything I'm about to describe about Bambi is why it should not get a live-action remake. Bambi does have a simple story, but is effective because of how it portrays Bambi's growth as a character from a young fawn who is curious up to the prince of the forest towards the end of the movie. And while I couldn't stop comparing this to The Lion King, which would take quite a few ideas from Bambi and then expand upon them, Bambi does deserve credit for how many foundations it establishes for later Disney films. The opening section with Bambi as a baby did feel slow on the rewatch, and the overall pacing had to be a big flaw for me, but the writing still manages to balance how heartfelt and mature this movie is. And for what came out in the 1940s, Bambi was not afraid to get into topics like loss, danger, or growing up. And even the darker aspects of the film are still impactful today, which is why I have a friend who is scared of Bambi growing up. Bambi still looks visually stunning 8 years later, which the seasonal changes in the movie make it feel alive, with the animal animation being expressive, with Thumper having the most personality in his character movement. And my only criticism with the visuals is how one deer in the background does appear static to the main characters, but even with that minor flaw, Bambi is still visually expressive of one of Disney's earlier works. The characters are memorable, even if they are simple compared to later Disney characters like Simba, Hero, or Raya. Bambi himself is strong because we get to see how his character grows as the film progresses. Thumper and Flower are both entertaining, with their personalities adding to the charm, and despite these characters not being that complex, the voice acting still works for the time it came out, especially with the performances of their younger and older counterparts. The score was another strength, especially selling its atmosphere and how tense the wildfire scene towards the end can get. Coming back to Bambi, I came away appreciating it more for how it plays a big part in Disney's history rather than how entertaining it is. And while I don't find it as compelling as many from the Disney Renaissance, it is easy to see how this influenced quite a few of their future movies. It may not have been one of their best movies, but it's still quite a strong film that leads the way for multiple films that will come out after. Not all of them may have worked in execution, but can still show how it influences the films to come. Now, we've officially left the just good or decent territory, and now we are finally diving in to the movies I consider great. The 8 out of 10s on the list. And this next movie starts what I like to call the underrated 6, which consists of 6 Disney films that I think deserve more love and attention that these films actually get from both casual Disney fans and audiences in general, which some of them were overshadowed by bigger releases, with some of these bombing in the box office, while some of them faded out of the public eye. And the first member of the underrated 6 I hadn't watched in years. It held up really well for being both funny and emotional, with a satisfying character journey to complement it well. And whenever I get into a conversation with anyone about this movie, they don't seem to remember it at all. And it sucks that this is commonly a forgotten Disney film by the general public, and Walt is that movie. Walt's character arc throughout the movie is what makes the story in Walt work, with him going through believing he's a real superhero dog to learning what it means to be a normal dog, which is satisfying to watch on screen, and it does resemble Buzz Lightyear's character arc in the first Toy Story, but Walt manages to do this surprisingly well in execution. The themes of identity and unconditional love are what sell the core of the film, and while the trust themes hit harder in Raya and the Last Dragon than they do here, Walt still executes it well in the relationship between Walt and Penny. There were also 2 scenes that completely got me on rewatch emotionally, such as the moment where Walt learns he has been replaced and the studio fire near the end of the movie, which I wasn't expecting either scene on rewatch to affect me as much as they did. And the biggest thing I did find wrong with the story was the pacing, with Mittens teaching Bolt how to be a normal dog. Because it does arrive too late into the runtime, it feels like it was placed in the movie too late. The writing does do a great job at highlighting Bolt's perspective and how he views the world, and I loved the interactions between Bolt and Penny, as this was a big part of the film's core. And while the chemistry between Bolt and Mittens does develop as the film progresses, a lot of the comedy comes from Rhino, which he steals every scene he's in, and visually, Bolt still holds up pretty well, which compared to earlier CG animated Disney films like Dinosaur or Chicken Little, is done a lot better here thanks to the lighting, the character designs, and the cinematography, with the action scenes being thrilling and the road trip montage being heartfelt, especially with the song that plays over it, and I love the map transition during the montage that carry over to the credits as well. The character arcs are another strength of the movie, since Bolt is compelling with a satisfying character arc. Mittens also works well in contrast to Bolt, despite being the weakest of the trio, and Rhino is easily my favourite character in the movie, thanks to his chaotic energy. Penny does not get a lot of time on screen, but Bolt still does a good job at showing how much Penny cares for Bolt, despite being apart for most of the runtime. The only character that feels like that doesn't get enough time on screen is Penny's agent, who is entertaining whenever he appears, but the movie doesn't draw enough focus to him to make him stand out. The voice acting in the movie was strong, with Miley Cyrus as Penny, and Mark Walton as Rhino being my standouts of the movie. And while I never thought John Travolta was perfect casting for Bolt, as I think Adam West should have voiced him, it functions enough. The score by John Powell is an underrated aspect of the film, since it does balance the emotion and action scenes quite well, with I Thought I Lost You and Barking at the Moon being those Disney songs that actually deserve more attention than they actually get from the public. This was my first time in years that I have rewatched Bolt, but I was happy to actually discover that unlike Chicken Little, this held up quite well, which, yeah, it may not be as clever as movies like Wreck-It Ralph, Big Hero 6, or Zootopia, but it's a story that's heartwarming, memorable characters, strong animation, and an emotional core that all come together to make this an underrated film. If you overlook this film because you don't hear people talk about it anymore, I recommend giving this movie another chance, because yes, Bolt is still a good movie despite being forgotten, and Bolt is officially the first member of the underrated six, which will be another few movies away until we reveal who the second member of the underrated six is. Going into this next film, I wasn't sure where this one was going to land, because the Silver Age has struggled with two things. It's either cramping so many ideas into a short runtime, like in Alice in Wonderland, or feeling unfocused, like Cinderella, Lady and the Tramp, or The Sword and the Stone. But even with that one section I keep forgetting exists, this one does avoid all the biggest problems that I have had with the Silver Era of Disney. I did see that someone had ranked this in the last quarter of their Disney ranking, and my response to that is Balderdash, as our adventure to Neverland was so much fun, and even when Peter Pan jumps through different perspectives. The humour did land for me quite well, since one of the funniest parts of the movie had to be in the opening, where Mr. Darling got frustrated with Nana, and the way he reacts to the dog being in his way was for some reason funny. And a lot of the comedy comes from the animation rather than the dialogue, such as the scene where Mr. Smee shaves a seagull, as well as the chemistry between Captain Hook and Mr. Smee carries the movie, and every time they're on screen together, I'm entertained. Visually, Peter Pan does manage to do a lot, such as the animation of Peter's shadow, Tinkerbell's colour-changing glow dependent on her emotions, and the sword fight between Peter Pan and Captain Hook remains one of the most memorable fight scenes in one of Disney's earlier films. Tick-Tock Croc works so well as a visual gag who appears frequently, and watching Captain Hook lose himself to Tick-Tock Croc whenever he appears never stops being funny. And even though the tribe subplot could be taken out with not much changing at all, this is one of the few early Disney films where I can actually say the pacing worked, because I didn't check how long was left with this one, which is a good sign for me since it moves from one scene to the next without feeling exhausting, and I found it more enjoyable than some of the other films this era had. Well, apart from one, but we'll get to that film. The characters are simple, but that doesn't mean that they don't work. Peter Pan isn't complex, but his adventurous spirit is what I enjoyed the most out of him. Wendy ended up being compelling with her struggle between wanting to stay a child and accepting that growing up is a part of life is a satisfying arc to see unfold. But the real star of Peter Pan was Captain Hook, which, like Ratigan in The Great Mouse Detective and Cruella de Vil, he is one of my favourite Disney villains to come out before the Renaissance. He's not a complex villain, but his expressive animations and personality make him one of the funniest in Disney, but in terms of the tribe characters, I forget that they're even there sometimes. Despite being a Disney musical, I don't associate Peter Pan with its music, since it does function well within the plot, but if someone asked me to list any Disney songs from Peter Pan by memory, without Google, I don't think any from Peter Pan would spring up. Which, the songs do their job, but it's Captain Hook that makes it more of a memorable watch than the music. And you know what? After struggling through most of the Silver Age, thanks to cramping too many ideas or being unfocused, Peter Pan ended up being fun, charming, and creative visually, as well as making it home to one of the best Disney villains to have existed before the Disney Renaissance, which I have seen this rank among the weaker films in Disney's catalogue, and I don't get it. Peter Pan is fun, it's entertaining. Why do you have to be so hard on it? I mean, it's not perfect, but I enjoyed it more than even a rare good movie in this era, like 101 Dalmatians, or one I just found decent, like Alice in Wonderland. But there is one more Silver Age movie to talk about, and that one is The King of the Swingers. This next film may not be in my heart, no pun intended, but this one was still enjoyable to watch, since the opening does a solid job at setting up its main character, but the movie does spend little too much time introducing the jungle before Jane enters the scene. I accidentally said a character by name. The first 30 minutes of Tarzan do feel slow compared to the rest of the movie, but once Jane enters, the pacing does start to improve. But what makes Tarzan's story work well is how it explores two different worlds clashing through the eyes of a man raised by gorillas his entire life. Which, when Tarzan is introduced to humanity, he needs to figure out where he belongs, which the themes explored here, such as identity and finding your place in the world, are handled quite well, with a satisfying ending to complement as well, but that does lead to one issue within the story. Unlike other Disney romances, I didn't buy Tarzan and Jane as a couple for most of the movie, since they played off like friends, which, just throwing it in there, feels a bit rushed. Tarzan is up there visually as one of the strongest looking films to have released in the Disney Renaissance, such as the jungle environments, the expressive character animations, and the sequences with Tarzan sliding through the trees look breathtaking. And like I have said, the pacing was a massive issue for me in the opening, but it does eventually pick up in the middle third. The character work is strong since Tarzan does go through development which involves him figuring out which of the two worlds he belongs in, and even through Collar, who doesn't get enough screen time in the movie, her motherly relationship with Tarzan does provide some heartfelt moments to enjoy. Jane was fun to watch thanks to her curious personality, and while Clayton is simple, with his motivation just being capture the gorillas and bring them back to London, he still serves his role well. Turk and Tantor were fun to watch as well, and contribute to most of the comedy within the movie. And the voice acting is strong since the British accents do help sell where the characters came from, with my standout being Brian Blessed as Clayton, with his voice being used in so many British adverts, and apparently Peppa Pig, which was a welcome voice in this film. When it comes to the soundtrack, Phil Collins did a stronger job here than he did in Brother Bear, with songs like You'll Be in My Heart and Strangers Like Me. But when it comes to the other songs, most of them land as a 7 out of 10 for me, because unlike other Renaissance films, Tarzan does not feel like a traditional musical, but unlike Brother Bear, Tarzan actually had good music. Mark Mancina's score does do a great job at selling the atmosphere of the jungle quite well. I already enjoy his work on Moana and even some parts of Brother Bear, even though I didn't like the film itself, which I didn't find surprising that his score was great here too. Tarzan is not my favourite film from the Disney Renaissance, but it's still a film I enjoyed even if it opened slow and the romance was rushed, held it back from the heights of some of their best works from Disney, like Hercules, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King. But it still has fantastic animation, strong character development, entertaining characters, and the score all make it a movie I can recommend, which there were moments in Tarzan that do feel like as they were transitioning into the experimental era, but other than that, it was still a fun film to watch. This film is one of those Disney classics that did surprise me a lot more than I expected it to. But for me, it does take a while for any form of plot to kick off. But unlike the wartime anthology films that heavily struggled thanks to their structure, each act here feels connected and feels as if it builds towards the ending. Even if it's not my favourite adaptation of Pinocchio anymore, thanks to the version from Guillermo del Toro on Netflix, the original from the 1940s still remains the most iconic adaptation of the book. One thing that did surprise me with this film is that the original source material was a lot darker than Disney's adaptation, since they did change it quite a bit to make it suitable for families, which, in a way, I get it. But there are areas in the movie that didn't age that well, such as the idea of children smoking cigars, which is one area that made the movie outdated, but the humor still worked for me. Especially in Honest John, whose personality made it more enjoyable to watch. The pacing is my biggest flaw with Pinocchio, since it does take a while for the opening to get anywhere, and Pinocchio as a performer did bring in loads of breathing time, but once we get to Pleasure Island, it goes quickly, and the Monstro the Whale sequence with Pleasure Island makes the ending feel cramped compared to the slower first half of the movie. For a 1940 movie, the animation is impressive, with the amount of detail they pulled off for the time is excellent, with characters such as Pinocchio, Jiminy Cricket, and Honest John being expressive in movement, while the lighting effects of the Blue Fairy look stunning as well, as the underwater sequences feeling believable thanks to the sea life and detailed environments. Monstro the whale was well animated as well. I may not have connected with the characters in this version of Pinocchio as I did in the Del Toro version on Netflix, but Pinocchio himself and Jiminy Cricket being fun to watch were enough to make up for it. The villains aren't deep, but Honest John stands out thanks to his personality, which doesn't make him one of the greatest in Disney, but still functional. The voice acting still holds up for the time, with Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket being strong. The soundtrack is where Pinocchio thrives, with music such as When You Wish Upon a Star, which not only is a great song within the film, but has become an important part in Disney's history, especially with it being the fanfare for Disney. I've Got No Strings was a fun song to listen to as well, but the rest did blend into the back of the mind. Despite starting slow and having pacing issues, Pinocchio ended up being an enjoyable watch, even if I do prefer Del Toro's version on Netflix due to it being more faithful to the book. But because of its charming characters, impressive animation, and iconic music, I enjoyed it more than Snow White, Bambi, and Dumbo. And when looking back at their earlier works, which excluding Fantasia, Pinocchio was probably the strongest film to have come out of Disney until The Jungle Book released. This next film was one of the biggest surprises of the marathon, since we are coming from a year that gave us the worst film from Walt Disney Animation Studios. And not only that, this is from the same director as Chicken Little, which apparently didn't feel like it was, but it is. And I was not expecting it to be as entertaining as it was. And boom, baby! It's The Emperor's New Groove. I really needed to think of a better way to reveal the title and an excuse to say Kuzco's iconic quote. Now, this isn't one of the most ambitious to come out of Disney, nor is it the biggest on the world building, but the plot is entertaining thanks to its message, which Emperor Kuzco starts off the movie as someone who is selfish, but watching him slowly grow and learn the value of others is what makes him satisfying to watch, with the chemistry of Kuzco and Pacha working quite well, thanks to Pacha's motivation to save his home being understandable, since he needs to work with Kuzco to help him change his mind about building a summer house on top of Pacha's home. But what makes The Emperor's New Groove stand out is the comedy, since lots of the jokes land quite well and had tons of moments that made me laugh and smile. My personal favourite scene in the movie had to be the potion scene, where Kuzco literally had to guess which potion would turn him back into a human. And then we have Kronk, who is not only the funniest character in the movie, but also one of the funniest characters in Disney, which he's not deep, but all he needs is to be funny to watch. And every scene with him in it, such as the little angel and devil, his lack of awareness, or just the way Patrick Warburton delivers his lines, and Kronk easily steals the entire movie. Yzma does work well with her desire to take over Kuzco's kingdom, does give the story something, which Pacha provides something that balances out the selfishness of Kuzco, which all four of them are enjoyable to spend time with, especially thanks to the voice acting of David Spade, John Goodman, Patrick Warburton, and Eartha Kitt. The movie does look nice visually, and unlike Brother Bear and Home on the Range, where the slapstick is exhausting, it's more enjoyable here, with the Peruvian setting giving The Emperor's New Groove its own identity from other Disney movies. The score was solid, with the opening song by Tom Jones being an absolute banger to listen to. At the end of the day, The Emperor's New Groove is not the most emotional work we've had from Disney, but even in the same year as Dinosaur and the same director as Chicken Little, which, go on, try and convince me that The Emperor's New Groove and Chicken Little are the same director, because The Emperor's New Groove ended up all the way at 23rd and Chicken Little was 62nd. You can literally not convince me they are the same director. And The Emperor's New Groove came out as one of Disney's funniest because of its entertaining plot, crunk, and the animation. It may have missed out on the top 20, but I still had a great time with it. This next film was one that was almost there in the top 20, but didn't quite make it down to New Orleans either. Even with a few issues with the pacing preventing it from ranking any higher than it already does, it's still a good movie, and that's The Princess and the Frog. One of my biggest compliments with the movie is Tiana herself. Thanks to her chasing her dream of opening up her own restaurant, which is one of the clearest goals a Disney protagonist can have. And you can see throughout the movie how hard she works to achieve that goal. And the film does do a great job at establishing Tiana as a character and what she learns while being a frog. But if there is one thing that held it back, if there's one thing that held back The Princess and the Frog in the story department, it's the pacing. Since it does take 30 minutes to get to a point where Tiana's transformed into a frog, meaning that we don't get much time with Tiana as a human as I would have preferred. But hey, at least it wasn't Brother Bear that completely destroyed its tone after the transformation scene. But with that out of the way, one area The Princess and the Frog also gets right is the romance. Since throughout the marathon, I've had loads of romances that didn't end up working for me, since they either feel rushed or underdeveloped. But Tiana and Naveen did work out for me, since their chemistry grows as the plot goes further, with each learning from another and learning what their goals mean to them. And by Naveen rejecting Charlotte for Tiana shows that this romance is earned, because you see them bond, not through an arranged marriage, not used as a part of a contract for the main villain, just getting to know each other and bond. And that's the key for a Disney romance to work for me. The humor was another area that did work for me in this film, since a lot of the comedy does come from the visual gags and the character animations that wouldn't be able to work in a live-action remake, with characters like Ray, Louie, and Dr. Facilier being the most entertaining characters in the movie. There wasn't a shortage of moments to enjoy here, as well as some scenes that can be emotional at times. Visually, The Princess and the Frog looks gorgeous, especially as Disney's final major hand-drawn movie, excluding Winnie the Pooh 2011, which they certainly did make the most of it with expressive character animations, musical sequences that feel lively, and make the atmosphere of 1920s New Orleans feel fun. My biggest issue with the pacing had to be the Bayou section, since while I do enjoy the characters that we meet there, it feels like it spends too much time there and not anywhere else, which makes it drag on more than it should, and can sometimes make the story feel like it's trying to pad out its runtime to reach the climax. When it comes to its characters, there are plenty of characters to actually enjoy in The Princess and the Frog, such as Tiana, Naveen, Louie, Ray, and Mama Odie, who are all fun in their own unique way, and add some entertainment to the journey back to New Orleans. But if I'm going to be honest, the show stealer of the movie is Dr. Facilier, since he is everything I could want in a Disney villain, without feeling like a villain that ticks boxes, since his style, energy, and personality all make every moment with him in it the most entertaining in the movie, which thanks to his design, personality, and manipulative nature, he stands quite high on my Disney villain ranking alongside Scar, Hades, Jafar, and King Candy as some of my favourite Disney villains of all time, with Keith David's performance carrying the character further. The voice acting in every other character, specifically in Anika Noni Rose as Tiana, sells the New Orleans setting quite well. The music is another strength the film has going for it, because even though I can't remember exactly every song from the top of my head, Down in New Orleans, Almost There, and Friends on the Other Side all stand out quite well, with the songs capturing the jazz identity, which makes The Princess and the Frog unique from other princess films, combined with Randy Newman's score, which Alan Menken not composing this is what makes it stand out from the Renaissance musicals. And even though the pacing does stick out rewatching this, I still had fun revisiting The Princess and the Frog because of its beautiful animation, enjoyable characters, strong romance, great music, and one of the best post-Renaissance Disney villains. It's not an all-time favourite for me, but it's something that lands on the successful side of the 2000s, which proves that Disney still had their touch as their first film in the revival era. This next placement might be a surprise to a few, especially since Raya and the Last Dragon managed to rank higher than it, but despite that, there is no denying that this is a film that fits in well as a part of the Disney Renaissance, and this may be the Disney film with the worst live-action remake of them all, but the original's still pretty good, and that's Mulan. One thing that stood out with Mulan is how Mulan's character progression is handled, which is similar to Hercules from the year before. Mulan's growth is shown through the movie rather than telling us through dialogue, and while this film does have a liar reveal plot, which has become cliche in animated movies in recent years, but unlike other Disney films, it works for Mulan because rather than chasing a dream to become a warrior, she is motivated by doing what's right and shows that she is willing to sacrifice everything for China and her family. The first act does take a while to get into, but when we get into the actual plot, the pacing starts to improve. But the only sequence I feel as if it didn't belong in the movie was the lake scene. But other than that, Mulan moves through quite well and keeps its focus throughout the runtime. And what makes this movie more interesting on paper, a war-themed Disney musical doesn't sound like a concept that would work, but in execution works well thanks to its comedy and serious themes, which while Raya does have a serious tone, but that focuses more on the world building, but Mulan, however, the themes of purpose and sacrifice are shown quite well, with Mulan trying to discover where she belongs in a country that expects something different from her. Visually, Mulan still has excellent animation with expressive character movements, particularly in Mushu and Cricky, and while the ancestor scenes are gorgeous thanks to the lighting effects used within these scenes, but how vibrant the climax against Shan Yu looks as well. And while the songs are not my favourite from the Disney Renaissance, they still do a great job at contributing to the story, but the song that stood out to me the most is I'll Make a Man Out of You. The cast of characters is another strength the movie has going for it, which Mulan works really well as a protagonist, since she does start off as someone who's clumsy, just like Hercules, but does grow into someone who's more capable. Is she one of Disney's strongest protagonists? Yes! But the main reason that Raya ranked higher than Mulan is mainly because I found Raya to be more personally relatable than Mulan. But I'll talk about Raya further when we get to that point in the ranking. Li Shang is not deep in character, but his chemistry with Mulan works within the story, and the soldiers are entertaining enough, but my favourite character in the movie had to be Mushu, because every scene with him is entertaining, thanks to his jokes, accidentally making things worse. Unlike Sisu in Raya and the Last Dragon, he manages to keep the tone in place without undercutting anything. And Eddie Murphy does deliver a great performance as Mushu as well, to the point I thought I was watching Shrek at some parts. My biggest issue in the character department had to be Shan Yu, because while he is threatening whenever he appears, he's barely in the movie, which, yes, the film does do a great job at showing him as a threat, but if we compare him to Scar, Hades, Jafar, or Dr. Facilier, or even King Candy, he lacks the development that I come to expect from a Disney villain. The voice acting was excellent, with Ming-Na Wen doing a great job, not only as Mulan, but her male persona in Ping as well, while BD Wong gives Shang the serious character that he needs. And Eddie Murphy as Mushu, like I said, made me feel like I was watching Shrek. Jerry Goldsmith did do a great score for this film as well, and while Alan Menken did compose most of the Renaissance, apart from The Lion King, Tarzan, and this film, Goldsmith composed a score that gives Mulan its own identity from the rest of the Disney Renaissance. Mulan, at the end of the day, just came out as a great movie, because it has a story that is compelling, excellent animation, a well-written protagonist, memorable comedy, and a great score. But the main reason Mulan just barely missed out on the top 20 is because it's missing a few things that make them some of my all-time favorites in Disney, such as a compelling villain, with one exception in the top 10, but we'll get to that, the world building with a few exceptions, and songs that I do consider to be memorable. But even if it did miss out on the top 20, Mulan still remains an enjoyable film, and comparing it to Mulan 2020, which is the worst of the remakes, it's not even a contest. We have officially crossed into the top 20 in all of Disney. It may take a few placements to get to the films I consider to be truly amazing, but we finally made it into the best film from Disney's Silver Age, which I can officially call the King of the Swingers, The Jungle Book. One of the biggest reasons that The Jungle Book managed to work so well for me is because of its encounter-to-encounter plot, which normally that has been a structure that I'm not the biggest fan of, which earlier movies like Alice in Wonderland, which didn't give each scene enough time to breathe before jumping to the next. But The Jungle Book fixed that problem, since we have so many memorable characters to meet along the way, such as Baloo the Bear, King Louie, and Shere Khan. Here, it shows how Mowgli can grow and learn about the jungle instead of feeling disconnected like in The Sword and the Stone. The Jungle Book still has a few issues related to the pacing, which have been all over the Silver Age, which even in good movies in this era, like Peter Pan or 101 Dalmatians, still have these issues. But unlike Cinderella, which I found unfocused, or Alice in Wonderland, which tried to stuff so many ideas into a short runtime to the point where I couldn't have a break between scenes, but The Jungle Book was probably more satisfying than those movies. Visually, this is easily one of the best looking films in this era, since the animation is expressive for a movie that released in 1967, which Mowgli's movement has so much personality, with each animal moving in its own way, with the jungle feeling alive with the well-painted backgrounds, and apart from one sequence that does look clunky, the entire movie moves quite well. The characters are another major strength, since a majority of the supporting characters don't go through a lot of development, which they don't need to, since they are memorable because of their personalities, with Baloo being likable, King Louie stealing every scene with him in it, and together they provide some of the most fun characters to have come out of Disney pre-Renaissance. But the only weak spot here is Shere Khan, since he is threatening whenever he appears, but he doesn't really get enough time on screen to consider him a favourite Disney villain of mine. The voice acting is strong, but I couldn't help hearing Thomas O'Malley every time Baloo spoke. For me, the only soundtrack pre-Renaissance that even compares to the Renaissance itself is the Jungle Book soundtrack. Since The Bare Necessities is a classic, I Wanna Be Like You is just so much fun, and The King of the Swingers all make for a great soundtrack, and the orchestral score helps in that department as well. Looking back at the whole marathon, one thing that really surprised me is that the final animated film with Walt Disney's involvement ended up being the best film to have released during the Silver Age. No, I do not think it's on the same level as The Lion King or anything in my top 10, but that doesn't stop it from being an entertaining movie, which, thanks to its memorable characters, fun animation, and memorable music, and just an enjoyable movie overall, The Jungle Book is fun to watch from start to finish, which that marks everyone from the Silver Age, which that only leaves the Golden Age, the Bronze Age, the Disney Renaissance, the Experimental Era, and the Revival Era left to complete now. This placement is going to be quite a shock to quite a few people, since if you have followed me for quite a while now, I did say in my 2020s ranking that I liked this film, so seeing it miss out on the top 10 might seem lower than others initially expected. Right, the thing is, this isn't because I disliked the movie, which I did like it. It did have a few flaws that actually held it back from top 10, and barely making it into the top 20. And the main reason it made it to 19 and not the top 10 is because even though I both cried and had fun with it, the lack of plot is what held it back. And I only consider 3 Disney films in the 2020s to be great, and this is the first one to have landed on the list, and that is Encanto. The story in Encanto is not plot heavy, but where this movie stands is because of its emotional core. The first act does take a while to get going, and there are scenes that don't do much for the plot, which does have an impact on the pacing, but the movie never needed something like a traditional villain to function. The conflict is driven by the struggles of each Madrigal family member. The expectations of Mirabel is put under, and how things can be misunderstood, which does pay off in the end. Abuela's flashback is still one of the most emotional moments in Disney in the past 10 years, and seeing Pedro sacrifice himself was a hard hitter on the rewatch, since this was actually a scene that made me cry. The writing in the film was good, especially with how it communicates the mood of each scene through the songs, which helps me understand the perspective of each character. The humour does work well thanks to Camilo's shape-shifting gift and Bruno's personality. And while the ending does feel rushed, the emotional payoff is earned because of how the Madrigal family is developed throughout the movie. Visually, Encanto is stunning, with Casa Madrigal having an expressive setting thanks to the way the house moves and interacts with the Madrigal family, with the colourful environments, the room designs, the vibrant animation, and the musical sequences, which do feel like they come from Muscat and Clements, but surprisingly it's not, and it still makes Encanto fun to watch. The musical numbers in the movie are strong, like Surface Pressure, The Family Madrigal, We Don't Talk About Bruno, What Else Can I Do? But the only real outlier of the entire soundtrack is probably the last song in the movie. The pacing is not perfect, given how long the first act can get and how rushed the final act feels, which the editing does do a good job at transitioning between moments, and Mirabel is a fun protagonist to watch, but not personal like Raya or Hero. Bruno ended up being the best character in the movie thanks to his personality, and Abuela's development surprised me with the show don't tell style presentation, and the voice acting in the film was still strong, especially with Stephanie Beatrice, Maria Cecilio Botero, and John Leguizamo all delivering great performances. Encanto may not have had its chance in the top 10 because of its lighter story and has a few pacing issues, but it's still great thanks to its emotional core, heart, and gorgeous animation, as well as featuring one of the best soundtracks in the 2020s besides K-pop Demon Hunters. Now we have made it to the second member of the underrated six, and this is one prime example of Disney coming out with a great movie that somehow bombed at the box office on release and doesn't get the wider recognition that it deserves. And thanks to taking a great twist on the Treasure Island story and making it sci-fi inspired, Treasure Planet is definitely a film that needs more recognition than it actually gets. Like I said, I loved how they took Treasure Island and reimagined it into a sci-fi movie, which honestly, Disney should really take more twists on iconic stories given how well this film was executed, with Jim Hawkins' coming-of-age arc is satisfying since he starts out as someone who's rebellious and gets himself into trouble before becoming someone responsible towards the end of the movie, and his relationship with John Silver selling the core of the film. Even though he has not always been kind to Jim, you do see their bond grow as the movie progresses. If I had to criticize one thing with the plot, it had to be the pacing, since the first half is spent traveling to Treasure Planet, while almost the entire second half takes place on the planet itself, which I think the pacing could have been a lot better if they arrived around the 1 hour mark, in which allows only the final act to take place on Treasure Planet and not the entire back half of the movie. One thing Treasure Planet did not get enough credit for is its writing, with fantastic world building to contribute it, as well with how they blend in pirates and futuristic technology together does make for something that stands out from other Disney films and is exactly the kind of world I was looking for in Strange World, but unfortunately faltered in execution. Jim's escape plan in the climax is what puts his growth to the test, showing that he is willing to take risks and think outside of the box to solve the problem. The dialogue is enjoyable, especially in Ben, and while some other Disney films did its themes more effectively, like Big Hero 6, The Lion King, Encanto, or Raya and the Last Dragon, Treasure Planet still delivers on those themes quite well. Visually, the film looks outstanding since the combination of 2D animation and CGI still looks breathtaking to this day, with the ships, planets, and spaceports all reaching their full potential and making this one of the most ambitious worlds we've had in Disney. The solar surfing sequence is exciting, Morph has expressive animation, and Ben's personality makes every scene with him in it entertaining, and to complement that, the action scenes are still easy to follow. The characters are also another thing that holds the movie together, since while Jim may not be as personally relatable as other protagonists like Hero, Raya, or Judy Hopps, he still has a compelling arc that makes him so satisfying to watch. John Silver is fascinating thanks because he is torn between personal greed and growing attachment to Jim Hawkins, which his decision to abandon the treasure to save Jim clearly shows how well he grew as a character. Morph and Ben have to be the best supporting characters in the movie thanks to their personalities, and while everyone else may not receive as much development, they still serve their roles in the plot well. The voice acting is strong as well, thanks to John Silver's performance, which does sell the character well, and Martin Short stealing the show as Ben, delivering one of the funniest performances in this era of Disney specifically, besides Kronk in The Emperor's New Groove. Then there's the score, which James Newton Howard delivered another excellent score, which is to be expected from him. Even in his weaker Disney works like Dinosaur, the orchestral music and rock instrumentation all reflect on Jim as a character quite well, and embraces the tone of the film quite well, which the original songs written for the montage sequences still fit without feeling dated. And while I don't revisit the soundtrack as much as I do Big Hero 6, Moana, Raya and the Last Dragon, or Wreck-It Ralph, it's still a strong score. Treasure Planet may not quite make it past Atlantis: The Lost Empire, because Atlantis does have stronger pacing, but Treasure Planet is one that deserves to be widely recognized among the Disney community, which it does succeed in areas where Strange World could not, thanks to its world building, memorable characters, and an excellent score. Movies like Treasure Planet are why I'm glad I've done the marathon in the first place, because I wouldn't have discovered how underrated some of these films are otherwise. Now we have made it to one of the most important films in Disney's history that makes all of the wartime anthology films look like slop, which, yeah, not all of them are, but this was the last film I ended up watching for the entire Disney canon marathon, and that is Fantasia, a real piece of art that needs to be experienced by everyone at some point in their lives. Going into Fantasia, I already knew that this was something special. Hence why I didn't watch this film until last, as this was something leagues above all the wartime package films combined. And that's what I got out of it. Forget all the AI-generated slop that you see flooding social media and go and watch Fantasia instead, because this is what real art looks like. And because this is one of Disney's most important movies, I understand why after watching it. Before this marathon, The Sorcerer's Apprentice was the only segment I have watched, through Fantasia 2000 that is, which everything else here was completely new to me. And what surprised me is how this was the strongest experience I had during the golden age of Disney as well, because Fantasia never relied on endless slapstick or filler to actually make it entertaining. And even with its pacing issues, every segment feels like it has a reason to be here, whilst the package films just existed to keep Disney afloat during World War II. The opening does take a while to get through with the orchestra silhouettes, but when the music and the animations start to complement each other, the film finally starts to come to life, with the Nutcracker Suite becoming one of my favourite segments in Fantasia thanks to its visual variety, and the Snowflake Fairies having one of the best visual touches in the entire movie. And then The Sorcerer's Apprentice is still a Disney classic, and for me is the strongest segment in the whole movie. And seeing its original context does make me understand how this is the most iconic thing to have come out of Disney's earlier works. The dinosaur segment was probably my least favourite in the movie, because while I did appreciate the scientific style of storytelling, it felt slower compared to everything else. But if I can say one thing for now, this segment probably has more artistic soul than the entirety of Dinosaur 2000. One thing that I really appreciated was how Dean Taylor's introductions to each segment and the intermission did help with the pacing a lot, since those moments actually gave me time to breathe between each segment and prevented it from becoming exhausting like Make My Music or Fun and Fancy Free. Even with Pastoral Symphony being one of the worst segments in Fantasia was entertaining enough despite being a foreshadowing to what Disney would make decades later. Dance of the Hours was fun with all of the animals performing together, but Night on Bald Mountain was a phenomenal finale, not only to Fantasia, but to the Disney canon marathon as a whole, which made for one of the most memorable endings in Disney history. For a film released in 1940, the animation is excellent, with each segment having an identity of its own, and the way the animation reacts to the music makes each segment feel alive. Especially the Nutcracker Suite, which is the best looking segment visually, while the dinosaur segment looks the weakest thanks to its colour palette. Fantasia isn't just a movie, it's an experience. A work of art, something we don't see in cinema anymore, which while watching it at home was special, but seeing Fantasia in a theatre with a live orchestra playing over the movie would be such a phenomenal experience, and one film in concert I would definitely go and watch immediately. And while it does miss out on the top 10 since it doesn't have character-driven storytelling I like to see in other Disney movies, it managed to secure the top 20 and only missing the top quarter by one movie. I don't let how iconic a movie is or how important it is in Disney's history influence where I rank each movie, which quality is the main thing I prioritize in this ranking. But I can't deny that Fantasia was a game changer for cinema, even as the last film I watched for the marathon.